Homeless girl saves millionaire's life, but unfortunately this happens. Comment giving a score from 0 to 10 for my story. Your opinion is very important, and subscribe to my channel to support my work. I'm counting on your help. The scream sliced through the stifling afternoon air like a razor, echoing through the cobblestone streets of the historic town at precisely 3 o'clock. 52-year-old widowed millionaire Richard Harding nearly dropped his coffee cup as he moved away from the window of his luxury apartment. It was always at the same time, always with the same desperate intensity. For the past 3 weeks, that sound had been coming from the old Victorian house across the street, a faded yellow 2-story structure with peeling blue window frames that clashed with the elegance of the modern building where he lived. "Must be a kid throwing a tantrum," he muttered to himself, adjusting his tie before returning to work. As the owner of the largest construction company in the region, he was used to solving complex investment and application problems, but he preferred to stay away from other people's dramas, especially after 5 years of living alone since he lost his wife on a rainy night he preferred not to remember. His equity in the stock market had grown exponentially since then, as if obsessive work was his only way of dealing with loneliness. Across the street, inside the Victorian house, the 4-year-old girl cowered in the corner of the kitchen, her young years insufficient to understand why her aunt hated her so much. The 38-year-old woman firmly held a metal spoon she had heated on the gas stove, her eyes red from alcohol, fixed on the child trembling before her. "You're a curse on this house," the aunt hissed, her voice slurred from the cheap vodka she'd been drinking since noon at the local dive bar. "Because of you, my sister is gone. Because of you, I lost everything." The spoon came down hard on the girl's small arm, leaving a red mark that would join the other scars that dotted her thin arms. The child bit her lip to keep from screaming louder. She had learned that screaming only enraged her aunt, who had worked at City Hall until being fired for constant absences caused by her addiction. The girl closed her eyes and tried to remember her mother's soft voice, singing that lullaby before bed. It was all that was left of her now, fragments of memories and a melody that insisted on echoing in her mind in the most painful moments. "Stop whining," the aunt grunted, putting the spoon back in the drawer as if it were the most natural gesture in the world. "Go to your room, and I don't want to see you until tomorrow. And if you get charcoal on the walls again, you'll see what real punishment is." The girl ran to the small room at the back of the house, a stifling space with an old bed and a crucifix on the wall. There, she curled up in the thin sheet and began to hum softly her mother's song, the only thing that still comforted her. She didn't know that, across the street, someone had finally paid attention to that melody. The businessman stopped reviewing the contracts when he heard the faint but distinct sound. He knew that song. His wife used to sing it when she cooked, a popular tune about free birds. But where was it coming from? He approached the window again, his eyes scanning the facade of the Victorian house. One of the back windows was ajar, and from there came that childish voice, trembling but persistent. For the first time in 3 weeks, he felt something other than simple annoyance. There was something in that voice that touched a sensitive chord in his chest, something that reminded him of responsibilities long buried under layers of work and isolation. His money and wealth had failed to fill the void that loss had left. In the house next to the Victorian, the 61-year-old retired teacher, Mrs. Gable, was watering her begonias when she heard the girl singing. Unlike the millionaire, she could no longer ignore the signs. During her 40 years of teaching, she had developed a sixth sense for children in distress, and that voice carried a pain that made her heart ache. "That's odd," she thought, observing the windows of the house she had known for decades. The aunt had always been troubled, but since she took custody of her orphaned niece, something had changed in the air of that house. The girl never played in the yard, never ran through the streets like the other children in the historic town. Mrs. Gable dried her hands on her apron and made a decision. The following morning, she would pay a courtesy visit to her neighbor. It had been a long time since she had properly talked to her, and perhaps it was time to get to know the little girl better. Meanwhile, the businessman remained at the window, an uncomfortable feeling growing in his chest. The music had stopped, but something in those few minutes had awakened memories he preferred to keep dormant. Memories of his former employee, who had resigned abruptly 5 years ago, a few months before the accident. She was a kind woman, always humming while organizing the construction company's files. Then, suddenly, she had simply disappeared from his life, leaving only a formal resignation letter and many unanswered questions. He had never thought about her again until he heard that familiar song echoing from a house where a child seemed to be suffering in silence. The sun began to set over the mountains when the girl finally fell asleep, exhausted by pain and fear. Her small fingers clutched the sheet, and in her dreams she flew like the birds she secretly drew on the kitchen walls with pieces of charcoal found in the backyard. Across the street, the millionaire closed the curtains and tried to get back to work. But he couldn't concentrate. Something had changed that afternoon, something he didn't yet fully understand. For the first time in years, he felt that perhaps it was time to pay attention to what was happening beyond his own windows. Night fell over the historic town, but the echo of that children's song continued to resonate in the mind of a man who had spent 5 years running from his responsibilities, and a retired teacher who had never been able to ignore a child suffering. The next morning brought with it the aroma of fresh bread from the local bakeries and the typical bustle of the historic town, awakening to another day. The retired teacher put on her best floral dress and combed her grey hair with extra care. There was something in that child's voice that wouldn't leave her alone, an echo of hopelessness that she recognized from her years as an educator. At 9 o'clock sharp, she knocked on the door of the Victorian house. The sound echoed through the silent interior until shuffling footsteps approached. The aunt opened the door with a bloated face and red eyes, clearly suffering the effects of the previous night's binge. "Good morning," said the teacher with her most gentle smile. "I've come to pay a courtesy visit. It's been so long since we've had a proper conversation." The aunt hesitated, running her hand through her disheveled hair. "Oh, Mrs. Gable, it's not a good time. The house is a mess." "Nonsense, dear. We've been neighbors for so long." The teacher stepped forward, forcing the woman to retreat. "And I would very much like to meet your niece. I heard she's an adorable girl." The aunt's face hardened for an instant before forcing a weak smile. "The girl is sick. High fever. Better not to get close." At that moment, a soft noise came from the kitchen, the sound of something being dragged on the floor. The teacher pricked up her ears, immediately recognizing the sound of a child trying to move silently. "Perhaps I can help," the educator insisted. "I have experience with sick children. I raised 3 children, you know how it is." "No need, really," the aunt replied quickly, blocking the entrance with her body. "I've already taken her to the doctor. It's just a cold." "It'll pass soon." The teacher noticed the woman's nervous hands, the way she avoided eye contact, and especially the strong smell of alcohol emanating from her even so early in the day. All the signs she had learned to recognize during decades dealing with troubled families. Across the street, the businessman watched the scene from his window while having breakfast. He had woken up earlier than usual, disturbed by confused dreams, where a child's voice mixed with memories of his former employee. When he saw the teacher at the door of the Victorian house, a strange curiosity washed over him. The educator finally said goodbye to the aunt, but not without casting an investigative look into the interior of the house. There was something deeply wrong there, and her experience told her that a child was suffering. As she walked back to her house, she decided that she needed to find a way to verify her suspicions. Inside the Victorian house, the aunt locked the door tightly and headed to the kitchen, where she found the girl crouching behind the table, trying to hide. The child had tried to reach a glass of water from the sink, but her height didn't allow it, and she had knocked over a chair in the process. "Didn't I tell you to stay in the room?" the aunt snarled, her irritation intensified by the hangover and the unexpected visit. "I was thirsty," the girl murmured, her big eyes fixed on the floor. "Thirsty?" The aunt laughed bitterly. "You want water? Then go get it in the backyard. And since you like to make so much noise, you can stay out there until I decide you can come in." The girl went out to the small backyard, a space surrounded by high walls and dominated by a single apple tree. There, she sat on the ground and began to draw with a piece of charcoal she had found near the gas stove. It was always birds, small, big, some flying, others perched on imaginary branches. Each stroke represented her dream of freedom, of flying away from that house where pain was her only constant companion. The hours passed slowly. The aunt had locked the back door, leaving the child in the yard under the hot midday sun. The girl began to feel dizzy, but she knew that knocking on the door would only result in more punishment. So she began to hum softly her mother's song, the melody being her only source of comfort. It was that melody that reached the businessman's ears again. This time, he couldn't ignore it. There was something too familiar in that voice, in that specific song. He picked up his cell phone and, almost without thinking, began to record. He didn't know exactly why, but an instinct told him that he might need that evidence. As he recorded, fragments of memories began to fit into his mind. His former employee hummed that same song while she worked. The woman who had been an exemplary employee until she disappeared abruptly. The woman who always spoke fondly about her little daughter, a girl named Lily. The businessman murmured, the cell phone trembling in his hands. The daughter of his ex-employee was named exactly the same as the child who lived in the house across the street. The realization hit him like a punch to the stomach. The child who was suffering in the house across the street was the daughter of his former employee, the kind woman who had worked for him for 3 years before simply disappearing. How hadn't he made this connection before? The millionaire put away his cell phone and began to pace back and forth in his apartment. He vaguely remembered his ex-employee mentioning family problems, a sister she didn't get along with, financial difficulties. But he was so absorbed in his own problems at the time, the growing conflicts with his wife, the problems at the company, that he hadn't paid due attention. Now, 5 years later, his former employee's daughter was across the street, and from the sounds coming from that house, she wasn't in a good situation. The guilt he carried for the loss of his wife multiplied, now including the regret for not having helped when she clearly needed it. His millions in investments and investment funds seemed insignificant in the face of this discovery. At 3 o'clock, sharp, the scream started again. This time, the businessman didn't move away from the window. He watched with growing horror as through the kitchen window of the Victorian house he saw a female silhouette moving aggressively. He picked up his cell phone again and began to record, this time with more determination. What he saw through the cell phone screen made him nauseous. The aunt was holding something in her hands. It seemed to be a kitchen utensil, and gesticulating violently in the direction of a small figure that he could barely distinguish. The girl's screams echoed through the afternoon, and this time the millionaire couldn't pretend they were just childish tantrums. When the silence returned, he remained at the window for a few more minutes, his heart pounding in his chest. He had just witnessed something that would change everything. The question now was, what would he do with this information? That night, the girl slept on the floor of the backyard, where her aunt had left her as punishment for making too much noise during the afternoon. The child curled up in her own t-shirt and looked at the stars through the branches of the apple tree. In her 4-year-old mind, she made a silent wish to her mother wherever she was, that someone, anyone, would take her out of that place of pain. Across the street, the businessman couldn't sleep, tormented by the certainty that he needed to act, but paralyzed by the same emotional inertia that had consumed him since his wife's passing. His net worth of millions meant nothing if he couldn't protect an innocent child who was suffering right before his eyes. 3 days had passed since the businessman discovered the child's identity, and the guilt was consuming him like a slow fire. During those days, he had systematically documented the episodes of violence, always at 3 o'clock, always with the same methodical brutality. His collection of videos and audios grew, but his courage to act remained paralyzed by the same cowardice that had haunted him since the night he lost his wife. On that Thursday morning, the retired teacher made a decision that would change the course of everything. She had spent the early morning awake, tormented by the certainty that a child was suffering just a few feet from her house. Her 4 decades as an educator had taught her to recognize the signs, and all of them were present in the Victorian house. She decided to approach the situation differently. Instead of attempting a new direct visit to the aunt, she opted for a more subtle strategy. At 7 in the morning, Mrs. Gable positioned herself in the side yard of her house, the place from where she had the best view of the backyard of the Victorian house. What she saw horrified her. Lily was sitting under the apple tree, completely alone, wearing only a torn t-shirt and underwear. Her small arms were marked by evident burns, some still red and inflamed. The child drew on the ground with a piece of charcoal, creating shapes that the teacher recognized as birds. "Good heavens," the educator whispered, her hands trembling as she held the fence that separated the yards. It was worse than she imagined, much worse. The girl looked up and saw the lady observing her. For a moment the two stared at each other in silence. Then, to the teacher's surprise, the child smiled, a weak but genuine smile, and waved shyly. "Hi, Grandma," said the girl with her tiny voice, using the affectionate term she gave to all elderly ladies. "Hi, my dear," replied the teacher, struggling to keep her voice steady. "Are you all right?" The girl glanced quickly at the windows of the house before answering. "I'm fine. I'm just drawing birdies." "That's nice. Do you like birds?" "I like them very much." "They can fly wherever they want," replied the child, her big eyes shining with a sadness that broke the teacher's heart. At that moment, the aunt's harsh voice echoed from inside the house. "Lily, where are you?" The terror that instantly took over the child's face said everything the teacher needed to know. The girl got up quickly, wiped her hands on her t-shirt, and ran into the house, but not before looking once more at the educator with an expression that screamed for help. The teacher remained in the yard for a few more minutes, processing what she had seen. The burns, the fear, the way the child reacted to the aunt's voice, everything confirmed her worst fears. She could no longer pretend she didn't know what was happening. Meanwhile, across the street, Richard Harding had witnessed the entire interaction. Through his window, he could partially see the yard, and the sight of the marks on the girl's arms made him sick. For the first time in 5 years, he felt a genuine fury burning in his chest. His former employee had trusted him in some way. Even if indirectly, even if he didn't know it at the time, she had left her daughter in the care of a family that lived in the same town where he lived. And now this child was being tortured while he watched from his comfortable window, paralyzed by his own cowardice. At 11 in the morning, Mrs. Gable made a courageous decision. She put on her best dress suit, picked up a tray with homemade cookies she had prepared as a pretext, and headed again to the Victorian house. This time, she wouldn't take no for an answer. The aunt answered the door reluctantly, clearly annoyed by the neighbor's persistence. "Mrs. Gable, I already said it's not a good time." "Dear, I brought some cookies I made yesterday," interrupted the educator firmly, "and I insist on getting to know the little girl better. As old neighbors, it's our duty to support each other." Before the aunt could protest, Mrs. Gable had already entered the house, using all the authority that decades of classroom experience had given her. The interior of the Victorian house was dark and smelled of mildew mixed with alcohol. Old and poorly maintained furniture occupied the living room, and there was a heavy atmosphere that made the air seem difficult to breathe. "The girl is sleeping," lied the aunt, blocking the way to the back of the house. "What a shame. Maybe another time then," said the teacher, but her experienced eyes had already catalogued several disturbing details. Dark stains on the kitchen floor that seemed to have been poorly cleaned, a metal spoon left on the stove, and mainly small charcoal drawings on the walls that had clearly been made by a child. At that moment, a low sound came from the direction of the kitchen, a muffled sob, almost imperceptible. The teacher and the aunt froze. The silence that followed was tense and revealing. "Must be the neighbor's cat," said the aunt quickly, but her voice trembled slightly. The educator smiled and nodded, but had decided that she had already seen enough. "Well, I'll let you rest then. But remember that I'm always right next door if you need anything. Anything at all." The teacher's tone made it clear that it wasn't just a casual offer of help. It was a subtle but direct warning. After the educator left, the aunt locked the door tightly and headed to the kitchen, where she found the girl curled up behind the gas stove, trying to hide. The child had cried when she heard the teacher's gentle voice, remembering the kindness she had once known. "You were making noise," accused the aunt, her eyes already shining with the familiar fury. "No, aunt, I didn't make noise," protested the girl, but her small voice sounded weak even to her. The aunt picked up the metal spoon that was on the stove and placed it directly in the flame. The child recognized the ritual and began to tremble. She knew what was coming next. "You want to attract attention, don't you?" the woman hissed as the spoon heated up. "You want the neighbors to come here asking questions? You think I don't know how to take care of you?" Across the street, the businessman had positioned his cell phone at the window and was recording again. This time, he managed to capture not only the sounds, but also partial images through the kitchen window. What he saw made him make a decision that would change everything. He could no longer be just a silent observer. His ex-employee had been a good person, a dedicated employee who always spoke of her daughter with love. That child was his responsibility now, whether he wanted to or not. His assets in bitcoins and gold investments seemed insignificant in the face of the urgency of the situation. While the girl suffered another episode of systematic torture, the millionaire made a call he hadn't made in months. He called his personal lawyer and old college friend, Robert Peterson. "Robert, I need your help with a delicate situation," he said, watching through the window as the child's screams echoed through the afternoon. "It's about a child, and I think it may be a matter of life." That afternoon, something more disturbing happened. Mrs. Gable, determined to act, decided to pay a second visit. This time, she arrived at the exact moment when the aunt was leaving to buy alcohol at the local dive bar. The house was silent, but the educator knew that the girl was inside. She knocked on the back door, calling gently, "Honey, it's me, the grandma from yesterday. Are you all right?" A silence, then a weak voice. "Grandma, Aunt is gone. I can't open the door." "You don't have to open it, my dear. I just want to know if you're hurt." I'm in pain in my arm," admitted the child, and the teacher felt her heart break. "Listen carefully, honey. I'm going to bring help to you, okay? Good people who will take care of you." "But Aunt will be mad," said the girl, the fear evident in her voice. "Not any more, my dear. I promise." When Mrs. Gable left the house, her eyes were full of tears of anger and determination. She had made her final decision. She wouldn't wait any longer. She drove directly to the center of town, where the small office of Child Protective Services was located. That night, after the aunt fell asleep drunk on the living room sofa, the girl managed to slip silently into the backyard. Her new burns burned, but the physical pain was less than the hope that was beginning to sprout in her heart. For the first time in months, someone had spoken to her with affection. Someone had promised help. She sat under the apple tree and looked at the stars, humming softly her mother's song. What she didn't know was that for the first time in months, two people were truly paying attention to her suffering, and that, in the coming days, her life would change in ways she couldn't even imagine. Robert Peterson arrived at Richard Harding's apartment on Friday morning with a grave expression on his face. The two men had been colleagues at the university almost 3 decades ago, and Robert knew well the emotional isolation that his friend had built after the loss of his wife. Therefore, the urgent phone call the night before had surprised him so much. "I need you to tell me exactly what's going on," said Robert, sitting in the spacious living room of the apartment. "You talked about a child in danger, but I need details." Richard poured coffee and positioned himself near the window, the place that had become his obsession in recent days. "The girl who lives in the house across the street is the daughter of a former employee of mine. She is being mistreated by the aunt who takes care of her." "Mistreated how?" asked Robert, taking a notepad from his briefcase. "Burns, daily screams, neglect." The millionaire paused, struggling with the words. "I have recordings, Robert. Evidence of what is happening." Robert was silent for a moment, processing the information. "This is very serious. If you have evidence of child abuse, you need to contact Child Protective Services immediately." "I know," replied Richard, running his hands over his face. "But there's something else. My ex-employee worked for me for 3 years. She left abruptly in 2019, a few months before my wife's accident. I never understood why, but now you feel responsible," completed Robert, understanding the emotional complexity of the situation. The millionaire nodded. "If I had paid more attention at the time, maybe I could have helped. Maybe she wouldn't have had to leave her daughter with that woman." At that moment, the familiar sound of screams echoed from the house across the street. Even though it was only 9 in the morning, both men turned to the window, and Robert could see the expression of anguish on his friend's face. "Does this happen every day?" he asked, horrified. "At 3 in the afternoon, religiously." "But sometimes also at other times," replied Richard, picking up his cell phone. "Want to see the recordings?" Robert watched the videos in growing silence, his face paling with each scene. As a lawyer specializing in family law, he had seen many cases of child abuse, but something about the systematization of that violence disturbed him deeply. "We can't wait any longer. I need you to give me all these recordings today. I'm going to contact Child Protective Services and the District Attorney's Office. This child needs to be removed from that house immediately." While the two men planned the intervention, across the street, Lily lived another day of terror. The aunt had woken up with a particularly severe hangover and discovered that there was no more alcohol at home. Her irritation multiplied when she found new drawings of birds that the child had made on the kitchen wall during the early morning hours. "How many times do I have to tell you not to get the walls dirty?" the woman screamed, holding the girl by the arm with enough force to leave marks. "You're a plague, a curse on this house." The child tried to explain herself, say that she had dreamed of her mother and that the drawings made her feel less alone, but the words were lost in sobs. At 4 years old, she still didn't fully understand why her aunt hated her so much, why each day brought new pain. In parallel, Mrs. Gable was at the Child Protective Services office, reporting everything she had observed to Anna, a former student of hers who had dedicated herself to the protection of vulnerable children. "Anna, I need to talk to you about a very serious situation," said the educator, entering the office without ceremony. Anna straightened up in her chair, her expression immediately becoming serious. During her 5 years as a Child Protective Services worker, she had learned to recognize when a complaint was serious, and her former teacher wasn't the type of person who would make frivolous accusations. "Tell me everything," said Anna, picking up a complaint form. While the teacher related her observations across town, Robert was in a similar meeting at the district attorney's office. District Attorney Lucas heard attentively while Robert presented the evidence collected by the businessman. "This is compelling evidence," said the prosecutor, examining the videos on Robert's cell phone. I will determine an immediate investigation and request the removal of the child from the family environment." "How long will this take?" asked Robert, worried. "With this evidence? We can act today," replied Lucas. "I will contact Child Protective Services now." That's how, by a coincidence that would change the girl's destiny, two simultaneous complaints arrived at Child Protective Services on the same morning. Anna was finishing noting the teacher's account when her phone rang. "Child Protective Services, Anna speaking." "Anna, this is District Attorney Lucas. I need you to make an urgent intervention in a house on Main Street in the historic town. We have evidence of serious child abuse." Anna paused, her pen suspended over the paper. "Is it by any chance the yellow Victorian house?" "Exactly. How did you know?" "I just received a complaint about the same house," replied Anna, looking at the teacher with surprise. "Two independent sources. This confirms the seriousness of the situation." At 2 in the afternoon, a coordinated operation was being set up. Anna, accompanied by 2 social workers and a law enforcement officer, was heading to the Victorian house. The teacher had offered to accompany the team, using her experience with traumatized children. Richard Harding watched everything from his window, his heart pounding in his chest. Finally, after days of paralysis, he had managed to act. Robert was by his side, both witnessing the moment that would change the girl's life forever. "You did the right thing," said Robert, placing his hand on his friend's shoulder. "I hope it's not too late," replied the millionaire, his eyes fixed on the team that was approaching the Victorian house. In the house, the aunt had left to buy alcohol at the local dive bar, leaving the child locked in the stifling room. The girl continued to sing softly, unaware that her life was about to change in a radical way. When Anna knocked on the door of the Victorian house and received no answer, she used her legal authority to enter the property. What they found inside exceeded even their worst expectations: a dirty and poorly maintained house, a strong smell of alcohol, and evident signs of neglect in all the rooms. It was the teacher who first heard the weak voice coming from the room in the back. "There's someone here," she said, guiding the team through the hallway. When they opened the door to the room and found Lily huddled in the corner, singing her sad song, everyone present felt a pang in their hearts. The child raised her big, frightened eyes, not understanding who those people were or what they wanted from her. "Hi, honey," said Anna, crouching down to be at the child's height. "My name is Anna. We've come to help you." The girl looked at Mrs. Gable, recognizing the gentle lady who had talked to her in the yard. A glimmer of hope shone in her eyes, but was quickly replaced by fear. "Aunt will be mad," she whispered. "You don't need to worry about that now," said the educator, reaching out to the child. "We're going to get out of here, okay?" 3 months had passed since the rescue. The girl had been temporarily taken in by a caring foster family, but the emotional scars were still deep. Richard Harding, consumed by guilt and the need to repair his past mistakes, had made a decision that surprised everyone. He started the adoption process. During this period, surprising discoveries came to light. Investigations revealed that his former employee had left a sealed letter at City Hall, a letter that should only be opened in case of an emergency involving her daughter. When they finally read the document, the pieces of the puzzle fit together in a devastating way. The woman had resigned because she had discovered that she was ill, an illness that would take her in a few months. She knew that she wouldn't have time to raise her daughter properly, but she also knew that Richard Harding was a man of integrity, despite his apparent coldness. In the letter, she asked that, if something happened to her and the child was in danger, he would take care of the girl as if she were his own daughter. "She trusted you," said Robert, after reading the letter for the 3rd time. "Even without saying anything directly, she expected you to do the right thing." The adoption process was facilitated by the circumstances and the evidence of abuse. The aunt was permanently removed, receiving treatment for alcoholism, but losing any rights over the child. On the day the adoption was officialized, Richard knelt before the girl in the judge's office. She was wearing a new dress, her hair finally well cared for, but she still carried in her eyes the shadow of past suffering. "Would you like to come live with me?" he asked, his voice choked with emotion. The girl looked at him for a long moment, then whispered, "Will you hurt me too?" "Never," he replied, tears rolling down his face. "I promise I'll take care of you forever, as your mother would have wanted." For the first time since she had been rescued, the child smiled. A small but genuine smile. A year later, Richard Harding's house had been completely transformed. The walls were now decorated with drawings of colorful birds, made no longer with charcoal in moments of despair, but with crayons in moments of joy. The girl attended a private school, had regular therapy, and slowly learned to trust again. Mrs. Gable had become an adoptive grandmother, visiting frequently and helping with the care. The businessman had discovered that all his fortune, his investments in stocks, and his wealth in dollars meant nothing if they weren't used to protect and care for those who needed it. On the night of the girl's 5th birthday, he found her in her room, drawing in her new notebook. It was a bird, as always, but this time the bird wasn't alone. There were 2 figures next to it, one big and one small, holding hands. "What are you drawing, sweetheart?" he asked, using for the first time the words he had learned to say with naturalness. "It's us," she said, smiling. "You and me. And this is Mommy's birdie, who is taking care of us from heaven." That night, while the child slept peacefully in her safe bed, the businessman understood that he had found something that all his money could never buy: the chance to make a difference in someone's life, the opportunity to transform pain into love, and the discovery that true wealth lay in caring for those who most needed protection. If you enjoyed this wonderful story, please comment giving a score from 0 to 10. Your opinion is very important. And if you love beautiful stories, subscribe to my channel. I promise to make your day better with my videos.